Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Lily Chang. I'm so happy to be here with you today. Happy Easter. I serve as the founding director of the Chinese Culture Center at San Diego State University, and currently I also serve as the chair of the board for the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum. We are so happy to present to you through the Chang Chinese American Experience and Beyond lecture series. And the topic of today is China Burma India Theater, the Second World War's Forgotten Theater. It's going to be presented by General William Chang and also co-presented by Dr. Cynthia Chennault. Our moderator for today is Dr. Bob Stein, who serves as a member of the board of the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, the chair of the Palama Rehabilitation Hospital, and a key member of the American Heart Association of San Diego. Welcome to the program. Dr. Bob, please take it over.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for your gracious introduction, Lily. And let me say also what an honor it is to be moderating this. And I can't wait till we get going with the China Burma India Theater and our distinguished guests. I happen to notice a fellow Jefferson person, Dr. Lockwood Young, who is on the call. And I want to first mention upcoming events. Next month, we're going to have a wonderful program on the Maritime Silk Road. When we think of the Silk Road, we usually think of the overland road between East and West, but in fact, there was a very vigorous maritime road as well. And this is going to be the maritime road to the United Arab Emirates. And we wouldn't want to miss this. This is going to be a unique bit of history that we're going to hear about. And it's going to be with presenters our own Lily Chang and Kisi Chi and Mohammed Al-Salameh. And then in June, on the third Saturday in June, a totally different one called Not Your China Doll, The Wild and Shimmering Life of the Chinese-American actress Anna May Wong, presented by Katie Lee Salisbury. So two wonderful programs. And at this point, I want to briefly turn things over to Lily Chang, who's going to talk about upcoming announcements at the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum. Lily?
Yes, coming up next week is our spring banquet, April 27th. And on May 4th, we have the Asian Pacific Historic District walking tour. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Lily. And right now we want to thank our sponsors, the PL Charitable Trust and the Shu family. And I'm going to turn things over again briefly to Yudan Wang from San Diego State University and the Chinese Cultural Center to talk about upcoming events. Yudan?
Thank you, Dr. Bob. Good morning, everyone. My name is Yudan Wang from the San Diego State University Chinese Culture Center. I'm so thrilled to announce our upcoming event. Right now, we have a current exhibit by artist Yu Chunming. It's called Ancestor Mountains. There are over 50 pieces of artworks is showing in the center. And on April 22nd, Tuesday, we will have a traditional Chinese painting workshop in the center. We welcome everyone come over, join us, and celebrate the art month, the month of the artworks. So our center, Chinese Culture Center, is established in August 2019, and we are located on the campus of San Diego State University, sponsored by San Diego State University College of Education. We are dedicated to promoting Chinese culture and history. Next page, please. Here, I'm going to announce the guidelines for today's Zoom program. After presentation, if you have question, comment, you may raise up your hand, Zoom hand, or write your question in the chat box. Our co-host, Elizabeth, will call on you with your turn. Before we start, we will take a group picture. Please turn your camera on just before the beginning of the lecture. And after that, our our program start, please turn your microphone and your camera off. Okay, now it's good time for our group pictures. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, there are gonna be 4. Next one, and gonna be the last one. Awesome, beautiful, thank you. Now I'm gonna turn back to Dr. Bob.
Okay, thank you, Yudan. I'm going to mention a couple of housekeeping things. One is that we use subtitles here, and we have AI converting our spoken English word into Chinese characters. When my Chinese-speaking friends tell us that it's pretty darn accurate, but don't be upset if when an English speaker attempts to say something in Chinese, it comes out garbled, but that's beside the point. The other thing is that we usually have questions of the audience, and the questions can be answered at the end in general with either raising your hand or writing it in the chat box. But today we're going to have such a full program, it's unclear if we're going to get to them during the show. Well, we may try to answer people separately if we have your email. And the next thing to say is I want to remind everyone that the Chang Chinese American Experience and Beyond is sponsored jointly by San Diego State University and the Chinese Cultural Center there, as well as the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum. And our presenter, we're thrilled to have retired Major General William S. Chen, the first Chinese American to become a U.S. Army Major General, 1989, who led a variety of crucial programs involving missile and air defense and others, and has been honored with an array of awards, including the Distinguished Service Medal. And we're also happy to have General Claire Chennault's only surviving child, Dr. Cynthia Chennault, speak, and she's going to have some very interesting personal reminiscences. And she herself is a professor emerita at the University of Florida, specializing in medieval Chinese lyrical poetry and society and the Six Dynasties and early Tang period, from 200 to 700. And before we get started, I'm going to have just a minute or two about World War II, and I'm doing it merely to set the stage, since I have yet to find someone under the age of 30 who knows much about the China Burma India Theater. So the first slide, Muting, there we go. So we're going to talk about background. And if you look at this map, here's the whole world, and much was involved in World War II, more or less. And the area on the right that's grayed out with the large purple circle is the area that the Japanese government had controlled. And when we think of the war in the Pacific, we generally think of the island hopping of America to regain control of the islands, Iwo Jima and Solomons and Battle of Midway. But we don't know. Let's look at the next slide, please. The Japanese controlled a shocking array of Asian countries in World War II as well, including Korea, much of the population centers of China and the various ports of China, Manchuria, which is northern China, current Vietnam, current Myanmar, Thailand, actually a part of India. They're bombing Calcutta, currently Kolkata, Malaysia, Borneo, Philippines, Taiwan. It's amazing. Next slide, please. And so we think of the Eurocentric history of World War II, and historians invariably say the war started September 1st, 1939, when the Nazi Germany invaded Poland. But believe it or not, Japan invaded Manchuria and took it over and created a puppet state in 1931. And in 1937, a full-scale invasion of China occurred by Japan. And in December of 37, there was the Nanjing massacre with over 100,000 Chinese deaths, most likely, maybe more. Here's a stamp put up by Japan honoring their conquest of these various areas. The next slide, please. And we're going to talk about flying the hump. And flying the hump, believe it or not, was airplanes in the 1940s flying from India and Burma over the Himalayas, or I should say, in the valleys between the mountains of the Himalayan mountains into China. A very dangerous route. And you'll notice the different roads, the Burma Road and so forth. Next slide, please. And the effects of the China Burma India war are felt today. Number one, the freedom of all the countries recovered from the Japanese. And number two, a large number of Chinese personnel and airplanes were tied up fighting in the China Burma India Theater, which diverted them from the Pacific Island Theater, enabling the U.S. forces to better win the various battles of the Pacific Islands. And the whole CBI theater played a role in politics to this day. The Chinese Communist Party may not have been in power if it wasn't for effects and the various machinations from the CBI theater and Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. It's very fascinating. If I could have the last slide, please. I just wanted to mention the deaths. So many people know that the Soviet Union had an enormous number of deaths, but people would be shocked to find that China was number 2 in terms of deaths, particularly civilians. Civilians are in orange, while the military was in dark red. And look down to find the United States, and you'll find the United States sort of in the middle, and far fewer deaths. And China and the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the deaths in terms of millions. So with this as a little background, we're going to have Major General Chen speak to us about his fascinating history, including his dad's exploits in the China Burma India Theater. General Chen?
Okay, thanks for the introduction. I'm going to talk about the China Burma India Theater and also the fact that it's World War II's forgotten theater. I'm not a military historian, but I've been a student most of my life on China Burma India operations. As a child, I lived through parts of the Sino-Japanese War and World War II. In 1943, as a 3-year-old, my mother took my older brother and I on an arduous journey from Shanghai to Guiyang to Chongqing. That's over 1,000 miles. And we went to Chongqing to join up with my father, who was a lieutenant in the 14th Air Force, commanded by General Chennault. Along the way, we traveled by train, by convoy trucks and sedan, and we were strafed by Japanese aircraft. First chart, please. And so early on, as a teenager, I first read General Chennault's memoirs, Way of a Fighter. Then when Jack Sampson's book, Chennault, came out, I bought it. And Jack Sampson was in the 14th Air Force. He was a navigator. And post-World War II, he joined the airline that General Chennault co-founded, Civil Air Transport, or CAT, better known as CAT. My father was also working for General Chennault in CAT. Of course, the story of CAT is a story by itself, but it's part of our history. In Anna Chennault's book entitled 1,000 Springs, she highlights the miracles of General Chennault. Number 1 was the American Volunteer Group, Flying Tigers. Number 2, the 14th Air Force, and number 3, CAT. And let me also say that As we speak, Hollywood actor, producer, and director Monty Markham is producing a cat documentary. So that'll also start with the beginnings of Chennault, with the American Volunteer Group, 14th Air Force, and then CAT. The next reference book shown, Skies of Thunder by Caroline Alexander, is about the Hump. And she does detailed research where she talks about the dangers of flying the Hump, the winds, the weather, no navigation aids, and limitations on the aircraft. The title of the book, though, is somewhat a misnomer because she also talks about General Stilwell and building the Lido Road, now renamed the Stilwell Road. The next reference, Song Mei Ling in Wartime China, is a recent book that was only published in December last year. So it talks about Madame Chiang Kai-shek and three significant aspects about her leadership. Madame Chiang Kai-shek was the mother of the Chinese Air Force. And number two, she led volunteer women to support military families, civilian families in the donations and providing of food and clothing. But most of all, it highlights Song Mei Ling as a leader in her own right, sitting at the same table with President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. Let me say that when I was a sophomore in 1958 at the University of Michigan, Madam Chiang Kai-shek came to receive an honorary degree, and I was chosen among the students to give a little speech and present a plaque to Madam Chiang Kai-shek. But what was significant about her visit in June of 1958 was we heard then of General Chennault in the hospital in New Orleans. So that facilitated her going and seeing General Chennault before he passed away. Last, I want to acknowledge our Veterans Database for the award of the Congressional Gold Medal to Chinese American veterans. So that's the source that I used in this presentation. Next chart. This is an outline of my presentation. I would say that in any normal presentation, for example, on the history of World War II, we would cover, for example, the first four bullets, and then, of course, the outcome of the CBI theater. In this presentation, associated with the major American fighting units, I'm going to also highlight the roles of Chinese Americans in those American fighting units. It's just like World War II being the unforgotten or the forgotten theater. Post-World War II, Chinese American veterans who fought in World War II were largely ignored, forgotten, and excluded until they were awarded, they were recognized and given award of the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest award given by the U.S. Congress to civilian individuals or to groups. Okay, next chart. This was the operational command structure in the 1943 timeframe of World War II. Admiral Mountbatten was the Supreme Allied Forces commander, largely because the largest concentration of troops came from the UK. Chiang Kai-shek was the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in China. And General Stilwell wore three hats. He was the Deputy Commander of Allied Forces. He was also the commander of all the American forces in the CBI theater and chief of staff to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. So the command structure was relatively straightforward. Next, but next chart, because of personality conflicts and clashes, the structure of the command was unable to facilitate smooth, effective cooperation. If we look at the right, General Stilwell, he was blunt and abrasive. He was critical of Chiang Kai-shek. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek had different strategic priorities. Not only did he want to and have to fight the Japanese, but he also wanted to and controlled the Chinese communists. And so that affected the commitment that he could give toward fighting the Japanese. Meanwhile, Lord Mountbatten was probably the most diplomatic, but unfortunately, he himself, number one, wanted to preserve the British Empire, and then, of course, also try and defeat the Japanese. Next chart. Okay, so here were the strategic issues and challenges. We all know that during World War II, the priority was Europe and then the Pacific. Consequently, for the CBI, lower priority for overall resources. Geographically, if we look at China and starting from the northeast of China down the China coast through central China on the China coast and southern China, that was all controlled by the Japanese. And so consequently, the only way to effectively provide for supplies, equipment, and ammunition, etc., was via Hump airlift operations. I previously talked about coordination among the Allies that resulted in friction. And then on the part of leadership, General Stilwell and General Chennault didn't get along. General Marshall defended General Stilwell, and General Chennault himself did not get along with General Arnold, the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Forces, nor did he get along with General Marshall. And meanwhile, there was formidable resistance from the Japanese. Next chart. So here are the major American and Chinese fighting units. And what I'll do is start going across the top and then the second row in highlighting these major American fighting units and then the Chinese fighting units. Next chart. The 10th Air Force was based in India and commanded by Brigadier General Clayton Stilwell. But notice that subordinate to him was the China Air Task Force commanded by Brigadier Chennault. And of course, Bissell and Chennault had feuds between them from way back. And General Bissell was promoted to Brigadier General one day ahead of General Chennault, and consequently the Air Task Force commanded by General Chennault was subordinate to Bissell in India. It wasn't until the 14th Air Force was formed in 1943 that the China Air Force was dissolved. General Chennault then had command of the 14th Air Force, controlling then all operations in China. Next chart. First Lieutenant Kin Fu Lee, for example, was part of the 10th Air Force. There weren't very many Chinese Americans in the 10th Air Force, but he was a navigator, distinguished himself with a Distinguished Flying Cross shown on the left and the Air Medal. That's a significant award for achievement on a flight crew. And so certainly that's very commendable. And shown on the right is a photo of myself and his son when we presented to him the Congressional Gold Medal for his father. Next chart. I'd like to recap the lineage of the 14th Air Force because it comes from the American Volunteer Group that was first established with Claire Chennault as commander of the American Volunteer Group, the original Flying Tigers. They were only in China from December of 1941 to July of 1942, but they were highly effective in gaining air superiority over the Japanese. But on the 4th of July in 1942, the American Volunteer Group was disbanded. The American Volunteer Group operated as contractors, and they were all in the company called Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, CAMCO, that was headed up by William Pauley, who was the Chinese the representative in China for P-40 aircraft, the manufacturer being the manufacturer of the P-40s, Curtiss-Wright Corporation. So when the American Volunteer Group was formed, General Chennault was promoted to Brigadier General and head of the China Air Task Force. And then in March of 43, he commanded the 14th Air Force. So I want to just show on the right-hand side the P-40s for the American Volunteer Group. And if you notice underneath the wing, the insignia there is the Chinese Air Force insignia. But the same P-40s, when they came under the 14th Air Force, the insignias became with the American Army Air Force's star insignia. The 14th Air Force also had P-51s, which were a far superior fighter aircraft compared to the P-40s, and then B-24 bombers. Next chart. Here's a recap of the accomplishments of the 14th Air Force. Next chart. Okay, here I show Chinese Americans that were fully integrated into the 14th Air Force. So the names are not that important, but if you'll highlight and read the functions or the assignments they had, they were a range of liaison officer, pilots, intelligence officers, communications officers, etc. And they were in the 14th Air Force headquarters staff or in fighter squadrons and fighter groups. Now, rank by itself is not that significant. Let me highlight for you, for Private Robert M. Lee, who still is a living veteran. Private Robert M. Lee, post-World War II, became a president of the 14th Air Force Association, who then sponsored reunions and so forth to perpetuate the legacy of the 14th Air Force. Next chart. Okay, this is my father, Moon Chen. He was a pilot assigned to the 14th Air Force Later, he was served in the Chinese American Composite Wing. Now, let me just say offhand that the Chinese American Composite Wing under the 14th Air Force was not a wing composed of Americans of Chinese origin. Instead, it was a composite wing made up of elements of the Chinese Air Force together with the American Air Force. So the fighter aircraft that were individually manned, they would be manned by Chinese fighter pilots. They would be manned by American fighter pilots. But the bomber crews usually had an American pilot, and then co-pilot and crew that were Chinese Air Force. So my father was assigned as a liaison officer to the Chinese Air Force in Chongqing. Now, the normal rank of the liaison officer to General that General Chennault had was a colonel. But the colonel that they had was probably a little too arrogant, didn't get along with the leadership of the Chinese Air Force. And so he put my father as a lieutenant, as that liaison officer. Okay, post-World War II, my father joined the Civil Air Transport, co-founded by General Chennault, and later he was a airline executive for Northrop Aircraft Company. Next chart. Lieutenant Liu Su Hu was a fighter pilot who was in both the 10th Air Force in India and the 14th Air Force. Shown on the left is him in training in the United States, and then in right, after he was qualified as a pilot, a photo of him, and he flew P-51 aircraft for the 14th Air Force. Next chart. First Lieutenant George W. Lee also flew P-40s and P-51s, and I would say that he, among Chinese American fighter pilots, was the most distinguished, to include fighter pilots that were in Europe, because he has 3 Japanese kills and 1 probable. He was awarded the Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, and Purple Heart. Next. Lieutenant Chu King Wong, he was in charge of recovery and salvage for downed aircraft in the 14th Air Force, whether they were crash landed for mechanical problems or perhaps shot down by the Japanese. But that recovery was significant because of the need for, P-40 parts, or if the aircraft could be recovered, to be repaired and reused. And as a lieutenant, he was awarded the Legion of Merit. And those of you that are veterans know that the Legion of Merit is usually an award for colonels or above. He was written up in the book written by Brigadier General Bob Scott, God is My Co-Pilot. And for those of you in my generation, you may have remembered there was a movie about the Flying Tigers, and it was entitled God is My Co-Pilot. And shown on the left is a photo of, at that time, Lieutenant Colonel Wong, who stayed on active duty, with General Scott reviewing the book, God is My Co-Pilot. Next chart. Pak On Lee was a mechanic, and I mentioned that the American Volunteer Group, when they went to China, were part of CAMCO. So Pak On Lee was one of 11 Chinese Americans employed by Campco that were part of the American Volunteer Group. Usually you hear of the American Volunteer Group as the 100 pilots and crewmen of China. But here, of these were 11 Chinese Americans. And Pakon Lee integrated into the China Air Task Force and 14th Air Force. Next chart. In addition to individuals who were integrated, there were all-American, Chinese-American units that are listed here that were part of the 14th Air Service Group. Now, my understanding is that the 14th Air Service Group came about in a discussion between General Stilwell and General Chennault, where they talked about the need to have a Chinese American unit where they could deploy to China, help train Chinese Air Force service members, and they could speak with them in Chinese. Now, interesting enough, some of you that know Chinese might want to ask, like myself, largely the Chinese Americans were of Cantonese descent, or they would speak Toisanese. So how many Chinese Air Force service members in Yunnan province would really be able to understand Toisanese and Chinese? Anyways, the Air Service Group served a great function. Next chart. And one of those units, the 407th Service Squadron, for example, was there, and descendants of the Air Service Squadron put together a nice book entitled In the Shadow of the Tiger. Next chart. Okay, I'd like to now transition to the Air Transport Command, commanded by Brigadier General William Turner. So they had the responsibility then for the Hump airlift. And you'll see some statistics about early on 1944, but when they got to July of 1945, the peak month, they had 71,000 tons of cargo. The Air Transport Command was supplemented by airlift from CNAC, China National Aviation Corporation, and CNAC was a commercial airline where about 20% of that was owned by Pan American Airways. Next chart. Lieutenant Dewey K. Lowe was a air transport command pilot that flew the Hump. And after World War II, he reverted to the Army Air Force Reserve, but he was called up in the Korean War, stayed on for the Vietnam War, and he was promoted to Brigadier General as the first Chinese American Brigadier General in the Air Force, and later promoted to Major General. So shown here at the left is the Air Force Distinguished Service Medal that he was awarded, the Legion of Merit, and then the Distinguished Flying Cross. So this is a significant achievement from a CBI veteran of flying the Hump. Next chart. Okay, this is Moon Chen, who was a Hump pilot for CNAC. In fact, he was one of the early pioneers in scouting the routes for the Hump airlift. But he's also most famous for flying out Jimmy Doolittle after Doolittle bombed Tokyo, and then he had to divert to China, where he and his crew landed, and then Moon Chen then flew him out by CNAC aircraft so that he could get home. And of course, Doolittle was awarded the Medal of Honor for his Tokyo raid. Now, American civilians and aircrew who were in CNAC that flew the Hump were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal, and they were also awarded veteran status post-World War II. Now, the namesake Moon Chen is the same as my father, Moon Chen. The last names in Chinese are the same. They were both Chinese Americans. Moon Chen was from Baltimore, my father from Ohio. And here's an interesting sidelight involving my father, Moon. He went to China in 1936 to fly for CNAC. He met my mother there, and he proposed to my mother, but my grandfather on my mother's side was a Chinese classic scholar, president of Guanghua University. But he asked one of his sons to conduct an investigation on my Moon Chen. And the first bit of information that came back was, yes, Moon Chen flies for CNAC, but he's already married. And so that question had to be resolved before my father was able to marry my mother. But the two Moons became drinking buddies post-World War II. Next chart. Okay, I'd like to talk about the Chinese Expeditionary Force. And the first Expeditionary Force was what was called Force X. And the next one, Force Y. The first Expeditionary Force operated in Burma, but they were overpowered by the Japanese. They were under General Stilwell, and unfortunately, they had to evacuate and retreat to China. The second Expeditionary Force was a lot more successful. They defended the Lido Road. They defeated the Japanese together with Mao's marauders, and that enabled the opening of the Lido Road. Next chart. I'd like to now talk about some of the Chinese Americans that were in the U.S. Army in the China Burma India Theater. One was Wan Lloyd Chan, a combat intelligence officer under General Stilwell. He was also a Japanese linguist, so he interrogated a lot of the Japanese prisoners of war. He wrote a book called Burma, and I can tell you, I've met Wan Lloyd Chan. For example, in the early 1950s in Washington, D.C., my mother used to take me to a restaurant in Washington, D.C., the Nanking restaurant, the only restaurant at that time that served Cantonese dim sum. We were met by a maitre d', always dressed up in a dark suit, and led us to our tables. And then, years later, in 1963, when I was a first lieutenant, I went to a short course on guided missiles, and here was this colonel named Charlie Chan, all dressed up in a colonel's uniform, and I immediately recognized him, and he confirmed that he was the maitre d'. His day job during those days and up to that time was with the CIA, and then he was a colonel in the colonel reserves. Later on, when I was a lieutenant colonel, he invited me to his retirement parade at Fort Myer, Virginia, and he told me at the time that he was the first Chinese American colonel to be the reviewing officer of this retirement parade. Now, when I got promoted to brigadier general, and I had my ceremony with soldiers and reviewing officers, etc., I said to myself, if only Wan Lloyd Chan could be there at that time. Okay, next chart. I want to highlight Ernest Ng, who was in military intelligence services, and he was director of the language program at Fort Snelling, Minnesota. He went to China as an aide-de-camp for General Carraway, but shortly after he got there, Carraway's command was discontinued, but he stayed on and became a part of General Marshall's staff. And shown at the right, for example, was General Marshall. And when at that time Captain Ng got married, he got married at General Marshall's home there in China. Okay, next chart. I want to highlight Colonel Guan Hin Ho. He was a doctor in the China Burma India Theater, but of significance, in fact, was he was promoted to colonel, and perhaps the only colonel of that rank, Chinese American, in World War II. Next chart. And here's Elsie Sito, the first Chinese American to join the Army Nurse Corps. And she supported the 14th Air Force. She was in hospitals in Kunming, Chengdu, and Shanghai. And when we had our official award of the Congressional Gold Medal, we selected Lieutenant Sito to represent all Chinese Americans to be the recipient in our ceremony. And she, in fact, is still alive today, I believe at 106 years old. Okay, next chart. I highlight Thomas Tang because, number one, he was in the China Burma India Theater, but post-World War II, he was the first Chinese American appointed to the federal judiciary. Next chart. John C. Young was a weapons team leader who trained Chinese Army personnel in World War II. But I believe he is better known for the fact of being a designer and implementer of having TNT deployed underneath a Japanese pillbox that was overseeing the Burma Road. And so that pillbox, of course, was an obstacle. And with the tunneling, placement of the TNT, and the detonation at Songshan Mountain in Yunnan province, that opened up the Burma Road. And post-World War II, he was instrumental in establishing a memorial in San Francisco at St. Mary's Square for World War I and World War II veterans. Now, shown at the bottom are Colonel Young's daughter and son. Connie Young Yu, of course, is very famous. For those of you that are descendants of Chinese railroad workers, at the 150th anniversary of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, she was the keynote speaker. Next chart. I want to highlight Eddie Fong, not so much because he served in the China Burma India Theater, but he was in the China Burma India Theater because when he was captured on Java in 1942, the Japanese sent him to Thailand. You may have heard of the movie Bridge on the River Kwai. And so as a POW, Eddie Fong worked on the railroad there in Thailand. And so shown on the left is him in a photo, and then post-World War II, Eddie Fong. Next chart. First Commando Group, commanded by Colonels Cochran and Janet. Allison formerly was a veteran and fighter ace in the 14th Air Force. And what they did was establish airfields behind the lines, attacked enemy targets, dropped troops, and they really laid the foundation for modern special operations. Next chart. The Sino-American Cooperative Group, headed by General Tai Lee and Milton Miles. To me, they were a model of how a joint group should be organized and how they should fight, because they were totally immersed and integrated. Next chart. Then there was the OSS. They were activated in Burma. Shown here are some statistics of their kills and their rescue operations. And of course, they opened the way for Allied forces in counterattacking the Japanese. Next chart. James Ngo, for example, operated in Kunming, Quaylong, and Canton, and continued later on in the U.S. Army, in the Army Intelligence Corps, mostly in counterintelligence operations. Next chart. And then I want to show the others who were Congressional Gold Medal representatives of the OSS that now is the CIA. Next chart. Merrill's Marauders. They were engaged in long-range operations, jungle warfare. They were critical in terms of being able to open up the Lido Road. Merrill's Marauders themselves were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. And so, for example, the two Chinese Americans shown who were awarded the Chinese American World War II Veterans Gold Medal were recipients of that, as well as the Merrill's Marauders Congressional Gold Medals. And so Merrill's Marauders established themselves and became the unit from which today's Ranger units operate. In fact, the insignia, the patch for the Merrill's Marauders shown on the upper right is identical to that of the 75th Ranger Regiment today. Next chart. Just a few words about the Lido Engineers. They began in December of 42. The first convoy going from the Lido Road to the Burma Road arrived in Kunming in February 42. If you look at the map, the upper left northwest is the Lido, the start of the Lido Road, which then comes down in a V-shaped and then continues to the Lido Road toward Kunming. And then in July, the tonnage increased to 6,000 tons, still a lot less than hump operations. Next chart. Okay, so what is the overall outcome of the CBI? Clearly, the hump lift was successful. And of course, without it, the tonnages to get to China for the 14th Air Force and to the ground forces would not be very significant. The 14th Air Force itself gained air superiority. And of course, they operated very efficiently. The Lido Road, named the Stilwell Road, was completed. And then the Allied forces were able to push back on the Japanese. In October 44, General Stilwell was relieved because of friction with the U.S. ambassador and the Generalissimo. Albert Wedemeyer was far more effective. Unfortunately, in June of 1944, General Chennault was reassigned, and then retired in October 1945. Unfortunately, when General MacArthur held the surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri at Tokyo Bay, General Chennault was not able to attend. Even General MacArthur there at the ceremony asked the question, where is General Chennault? Next chart. Okay, this kind of recaps the China Burma India Theater. I want to highlight the photo in the center. In 2017, I went to Flying Tiger museums in China. One of those was at Tongchang in Burma, Yunnan province. And on the grounds was this statue showing General Stilwell and General Chennault. And with their differences, you can almost ask the question, why would anybody show statues of the two generals side by side? Okay, I can only surmise on the builders of this memorial that they recognized and appreciated the contributions of General Chennault and General Stilwell, and then put them side by side in this World War II memorial. Next chart. Okay, here's a quick legacy of our generals. Stilwell, he certainly had determination, and we have to have respect for that determination. General Chennault was the father of pursuit aviation and clearly demonstrated his air warfare tactics in order to gain air superiority. General Wedemeyer was successful in building up the Chinese forces, expanding hump operations, and then facilitating cooperative joint operations. William Turner not only directed the hump, but the Berlin airlift and the Korean airlift, and he, for example, established the basis for our current strategic airlift operations. Next chart. Johnny Allison, who commanded the 1st Commando Unit, then pioneered Air Commando operations. Milton Miles, together with General Tai Lee, demonstrated the effectiveness of the immersion of American and Chinese in intelligence operations. Merrill's Marauders, with his leadership, pioneered special operations for the U.S. Army. I want to comment on Sun Lee Run, who commanded the X-Force, and he was well known and respected. He was a Virginia Military Institute graduate, known as Rommel of the East, well respected by the British and General Stilwell. Wei Wong commanded the Y Force, and he was known for 100 victories, and certainly without his leadership, the Burma Road could not have been opened. Next chart. Very quickly, Chinese-American World War II veterans served in every branch of the service, mostly integrated into those services. However, 40% were non-U.S. citizens because of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was still in place until repealed in December of 1943. Yet, they still volunteered and served as Americans in World War II. So it was the Congressional Gold Medal that finally gave recognition and honor to our Chinese American World War II veterans. Next. Okay, so just for the images, I want to highlight the platforms that they worked on. The F-40 on the right top, Flying Tiger aircraft, the Sherman tank, and then the USS Missouri. And then shown on the left, images to represent each of the services, and then an image of a Army nurse to represent women who served in World War II. Next chart. So here's the legacy of our Chinese American veterans. I'd like to just focus on the bottom two. They opened up opportunities for Asians and Chinese Americans to be in mainstream America post-World War II, and they continued the legacy of Chinese Americans, enabling our follow-on generations to live the American dream. Next chart. I want to just talk about this photo in September of 2021, when we had our national award ceremony for Chinese American World War II veterans. Seated in the front are 4 living veterans, but most importantly in the back, and this is a historical photo in the sense that up to then, there was nowhere a photo with a gathering of Chinese American and admirals that were either retired or on active duty. And of course, it was the World War II veterans that demonstrated their skills and competencies that paved the way for follow-on generations of Chinese Americans to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. Next. Okay, I'd like to especially acknowledge the Chinese American Veterans Recognition Project. And perhaps on the last bullet, in doing so, they help bring together the next of kin of our Chinese American veterans to celebrate their veterans' proud service. Next chart. With that, I'd like to transition to Cynthia Chennault, but I want to show these words from General Chennault from his book, Way of the Fighter. And I would say that these words written in 1949 are significant back then as well as it is today. It is my fondest hope the sign of the flying tiger will remain aloft just as long as it is needed, and it will always be remembered on both shores of the Pacific as a symbol of two great peoples working toward a common goal in war and peace. Bob, turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very, very much, General Chen. And I think we're all just thrilled to have your not only wonderful history of the CBI theater, but also the personalized Chinese American bios and contributions to the war, which was wonderful and unmatched. And we're just so happy to have you today. I also want to point out, when I was a little boy, the airplane models that I made were two that I distinctly remember. The P-47 Thunderbolt model made by Revell Plastic Model Company, and also my P-40 Flying Tiger. And so I thought for this talk, I would go and buy another P-40 Flying Tiger, and it's still made by Revell. Believe it or not, in 2025, they're still making these planes. And if you'll notice, it has the Kuomintang symbolism on it, and not the U.S. Army. So I thought that you'd find that to be amusing. Dr. Chennault, we're thrilled to have you here today to talk about your reminiscences about your mom and your dad, and your own story about China. So Dr. Chennault, if you would take it away, we're happy to have you here today.
Thanks so much. And I'll try to not linger or malinger too long over specific slides. I know we're short on time, but on that nationalist emblem, I know that when the AVG was first out in Asia and then first in Burma, they used the nationalist symbol because the emblem, because America did not want the Japanese to know that there were American pilots fighting them. They didn't want to be, this is before Pearl Harbor, right? So let me go right into my talk. I'll be treating some family history that's not so well known as the years when my father became famous as the commander of Flying Tigers. And in keeping with the mission of the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum and also the Chinese American Experience Program of our co-sponsor, San Diego State University, I want to talk a little bit about my mother's career. Okay, well, let's have the next slide. We'll start with my dad. And his father, John Stonewall Jackson Chennault, was born during the Civil War and was named after one of the heroes of the Confederacy. He was married to Jessie B. Lee, who belonged to the same family as Robert E. Lee. So you will have surmised by this that they must have lived in the South, and that's right. They lived in Gilbert, Louisiana, where my grandfather was a farmer. Next slide, please. Then we move to the earliest photo I have of, it's a portrait photo of my father and his younger brother, Uncle Bill. And one thing that struck me about this is how even at the age of 6 years old, my father stood very straight in all his photos, very erect and with this faraway gaze in his eyes, you know, steadfast, as though he had a purpose. Let's go on to the next one, and you'll see the same posture and that steadfast gaze here in 1917, where my father is wearing the uniform of his first military position, which was a first lieutenant in the Infantry Reserve Corps. And if he's looking out toward the future, it seems, what he's looking at is actually his ambition to become a pilot. He was not going to stay in the infantry reserve. And he applied twice to flight training and was rejected. Then after he was finally accepted, he failed his test, flying test that would have enabled him to become a member of the Army Air Corps. And here in connection with Bill's mention of conflicts, problems of personalities and priorities during World War II, I'll have to say that my father was very confident in his own ideas and often got into trouble with superiors. So here's an early instance. He and the instructor who was giving him the flying test had an argument right in the cockpit just before the landing, as my father was preparing to show how he could land a plane. And my father said to the instructor, "If you talk to me that way again," the instructor had criticized him abrasively, "if you talk to me that way again, I'll let you fly the plane." Well, he talked to him that way again, and my father just let go of the controls. So it was the instructor who landed the plane and told my father as they were getting out of it, "You failed." Fortunately, he was able to get a flying test with another instructor and passed. Next slide, please. And this is the back of the photo where he dates it with his first office, military office in Gilbert, his hometown, where he was shown in front of his parents' home. Next slide, please. Well, after passing that test, it was just a matter of a few years before he became known as one of the top pilots that the Army Air Corps had. And during the early 30s, there was a naval group called Helldivers, a team of Navy pilots who gave aeronautical shows around the country doing stunts and so forth. And the Army Air Corps wanted one that would rival it. So my father was commissioned to head such a group. And he and his two other pilots in the group called themselves the Flying Trapeze, after a popular song of the time, Three Men on a Flying Trapeze. And they gave shows all over the US. And many people in the early 30s had never seen a plane before, so a lot of people came to these shows. For my father, this was, however, not simply an entertainment, but a demonstration of his theory of how fighter pilots could fly in formation and be a very effective force in time of war. And this idea had actually occurred first in the German military. You may have heard of the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, who was very effective with his flying circus during World War I. But his ideas, his theories were soon forgotten, and most people associated fighter planes with the one-on-one dogfights of World War I and not with coordinated maneuvers. In 1935, my father authored The Role of Defensive Pursuit, in which he laid out his idea of what future wars would look like, in which air warfare would have the upper hand, and fighter pilots and fighter planes would be very effective in group formation. This idea was not that well accepted, his argument for the value of fighter planes, because everybody, especially the top brass, was enthralled with the idea of bomber plane development. So he wasn't able to really push this idea anywhere. I mentioned Billy McDonald at the left as a member of the team because my father later met up with him in China, and he was instrumental in my father being recruited by the Chinese to advise their Air Force. Next slide, please. So by 1937, my father decided to retire from the Army Air Corps because he was not getting anywhere. And you see in his first excerpt in a letter to his younger brother, Bill, he says that nothing he has advocated in the last 10 years has been attained and he felt that his career as an officer was thoroughly blocked. And then comes the news that he was offered the job of aviation advisor to the central Chinese government. And this invitation actually came from Madame Chiang Kai-shek, whom Bill mentioned, General Bill mentioned, was very much involved with the Chinese Air Force. And he tells his brother that he's going to have full control over all military aviation. And then finally, that he's confident that the Chinese government is hiring him to whip H-E-L-L. He doesn't spell the whole word because he never swore. He wants to whip hell out of Japan. And I'm all for it, he says. Next slide. And we continue in the letter where you can see how excited he is that finally he will have free rein to organize and direct schools and tactical organizations and air defense materials, all according to my own ideas as to what is sound in military aeronautics. And how could he ever have such an opportunity in the US? He would never have such an opportunity, especially not trying out his ideas in the heat of war. So he tells Bill, I couldn't possibly pass up this opportunity. Very few boys from Gilbert, Louisiana will ever have the slightest chance to influence the history of the future years. You can see here how confident he is and purposeful. So next slide, please. So he went on to China and he wrote a manual in 1938, and I've put a cover on this on our copy that we have at our office in DC. And there's Billy McDonald there with his back half turned to the camera. And Billy McDonald had earlier resigned from Army Air Corps to work for CNAC, which, as General Bill mentioned, is Chinese National Air Corporation. And their early work was mainly to fly airmail around the country, and later on their pilots also flew the Hump. There are many American pilots. Some of them also served as instructors to Chinese pilots. So this is a manual that my father wrote in 38 because, of course, he couldn't train all the pilots of the Chinese Air Force Academy by himself. So he wrote this for other instructors. Let's go to the table of contents in the next slide. So this is a work in 43 chapters, 190 pages. The early chapters have to do with matters such as the natural and the mechanical pilot, chapter 5, and how what kind of attitude the instructor and student should have in 7. And then it moves on to what you would call the actual, training part of it. So how do you fly straight and level? How about the climb and the glide? How do you make turns? How do you make a climbing turn? And let's have the next slide. And this manual is also accompanied by my father's hand-drawn illustrations. So here's a sketch of the correct degree of bank in an exercise where the pilot flies figure eights around a pylon. And if you're curious, the correct degree of bank is shown by the middle plane. And notice that these are biplanes. In 1938, the Chinese Air Force had 3 fighter groups, 2 of which were equipped with biplanes. And the third one had more modern Boeing P-26s. Let's have the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, so from the time my father left for China in 1937, in May of 37, he kept a war diary. So the first entry is the first entries are his experience on a slow boat to China, and then it moves on through the later years. The excerpt that's illustrated here dates from New Year's Day, 1938, January 1, 1938, and it describes a lunch held by Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang Kai-shek, at which my father enjoyed this, and another guest that is mentioned is the Alexander von Falkenhausen from Germany. And he was the advisor to the Chinese army. So a parallel, my father was training Air Force, and Falkenhausen was training Chinese army. Falkenhausen left later in 38 when Germany signed a pact with Japan. And of course, he couldn't stay on in China thereafter. And one of the things I'm doing with the materials that have been left to me from the war years is trying to make them even more available to researchers. We've had a number of the scholars come to write books about flying tigers and my father, and also actually about my mother. So I want to translate these into printed form and digitize them so that not only do people who come to the office can see them, but eventually they'll be on a website where they'll have a broader readership. Next slide, please. Now, my father's in China in 37 on, but by 39, he realized that he and his corps of other instructors couldn't possibly train enough pilots to meet the onslaught of the Japanese invasion, which was fast and furious. So he wanted to go to the U.S., back to the U.S., to ask for U.S. government assistance, military assistance, in the form of a fighter group in particular. And this would be of U.S. Reserve officers in all the branches. And they would already be trained. And all he had to do then was retrain them in tactics that were special against Japanese pilots, against the Japanese Zero, which he had known well, during the years of his experience. And I point out that on the far right is a fellow called Thomas G. Corcoran, nicknamed Tommy the Cork. And he was one of FDR's New Deal advisors, part of that brain trust. And he played a pivotal role in the formation of the American Volunteer Group. And we'll go on to the next slide, and I'll explain why he was so instrumental. Well, by this time, Roosevelt was already looking for a way to prepare for the war that he felt America would inevitably be drawn into. This is 1940, before Pearl Harbor. He thought there was probably no way the U.S. could keep out of this with Hitler's invasions, of Europe and the Japanese imperialist spread over Southeast Asia and into China and Manchuria. So he had heard of Chennault, and Chennault actually had been recommended to him as somebody that he could put in China, to prepare for the war there. And so Roosevelt wanted to find out more about him, and he asked Tommy the Cork to interview my father and then let him know what he thought. So first thing Thomas Corcoran did was to contact my father's former superiors in the Army Air Corps. And I mentioned to you earlier during his flight test how he didn't like his teacher, the way his teacher was talking to him. And the former superiors in the Army Air Corps said my father was insubordinate. And one of them said he's incorrigibly insubordinate. In any case, Corcoran made the appointment to interview my father. And he says in his memoirs, unpublished memoirs, which are at the Library of Congress, he writes that for the first 10 minutes of speaking with Chennault, he didn't know whether he was talking to a genius or a madman. But then my father drew out maps that he had prepared and showed Corcoran the airfields and the runways that the Chinese had built by their labor, and also by a radio alert network that had been set up all over China, well, mainly the southwestern China, which the Japanese did not yet control. And this alert system they could relay very quickly if they saw Japanese planes approaching a certain location and be ready for that. So this is something he had talked about in the role of defensive pursuit. So Corcoran was convinced, yes, this fellow is very prepared and he's our man. And we contacted his boss, FDR, to recommend my father for the job. And Roosevelt just had a question. He said, well, is he manageable? And Corcoran told him honestly, I wouldn't like to be his boss in an organizational chart. I think you should just let him run the show and then you run him. You will be the Queen Elizabeth to his Sir Francis Drake. That's how he put it. So give him free rein. And then on April 13th, 1941, FDR signed this secret order allowing reserve pilots from all branches to go and join this American volunteer group, and they would be accompanied by crew support staff as well. And they were first stationed in Burma, and then after Pearl Harbor, they moved right away into those airfields that were prepared in China. Let's have the next slide. So General Bill has so well covered the history of the World War II, and I'm just going to now pass on to some things about my mother that people may not know so well. She was a journalist by profession. She was a war correspondent, and she was sent by the Chinese news agency to interview my father. It was back in 44. And they re-met later in Shanghai after the war. They got married in 1947. Now, quickly, to fulfill a promise I made to my mother decades ago, she said, whenever people ask about you, about me and your father, please be sure to say that I was 30 years younger. So now I've taken care of that, and we can go on to the next slide. So they married when she was 24 and he was 54. My mother was a journalist and also an editor, and here she and my father are looking at a bulletin of the CAT, Civil Air Transport Corporation, where General Bill's father was right-hand man to my father. On the left is a collection of her works that was published in the PRC. There are short stories, there are opinion pieces written for newspapers and so forth. And that's me and my sister at the bottom. I've got this dubious look on my face because my sister just stole my doll. Notice she's got 2 dolls. I don't have any. Let's get the next slide, please. I don't want to go over time. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yes, she was also known for her parties at the Watergate. And here you have Ford, Gerald Ford, and his wife Betty. This is when he was vice president. At the far left is Thomas G. Corcoran. And then did we skip the slide businesswoman and Republican campaign fundraiser? Here we go. And then she also wrote books in English. The first one about her marriage with my father, the second about her career living in Washington, D.C. And then you have her at the Nixon campaign fundraiser. So let's go ahead to the next slide because we're almost at 2:30. Oh, Eastern time. Next slide, please. Yes. So in 1981, after an absence of many decades, since she left China in 49, when it fell to the communists, her political views, changed, and she felt it was necessary that the U.S. and China cooperate because these are 2 huge powers. And so in 81, she went back to China, and there she is with then President Deng Xiaoping. I was at the Chinese embassy last month for a commemoration of the end of World War II, which they call the War of Resistance. And one of the consuls told me a story that I had heard before. At the dinner that night with Deng Xiaoping, he rearranged the seating chart so that he would have my mother next to him. And he said to people, there's 100 US senators, but only one Anna Chennault. So my mother at that time made the trip with several congressmen, including Ted Stevens of Alaska, who was a member of the 14th Air Force. The center slide shows me with my mother on our last trip to China together, 2015. On the right, we also went to Taipei that next month. Quickly, I'll go to the next slide. Next slide. Yes, so on the left, this is a book by a researcher who came to use our materials at the office, and this is about my mother, of course, and it's titled Informal Diplomacy in Asian Relations. On the right is a magazine stand in which I have magazines with either one of my parents on the cover, and then the final slide at Arlington Cemetery. The next slide, final slide. So here you see on the front, there's my father's tombstone in English and my mother beneath. She passed away in 2018. And notice the tree growing behind it. My mother had that tree planted at Arlington. It's called a red bean tree. And you see on the back face of the tombstone, you can see the boughs with these little red beans on it. And this in Chinese culture is that this red bean is a symbol of close friendship, of missing somebody you love or a close friend. And she had that planted when you could still ask Arlington to do such things. Let's see. I think that should be the end of my talk. It's at 2:31 now.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both Dr. Chennault as well as Major General Chen for coming today. And I think everyone in attendance would be agreeing with me that this was a remarkable session, and we all just loved it. And the fact that there are not enough time for questions more than made up for by the excellence of your presentations. And I want to again thank you folks and say that I'd like the principals to stay on for about 5 minutes of debriefing, if you wouldn't mind. And then I want to also remind everyone to tune in next month to hear the Maritime Silk Road Voices from the UAE, pointing out, by the way, to you folks that the term Silk Road was actually invented out of the head of Baron von Richthofen's uncle, who was an archaeologist in the 1870s. And we'll look forward to hearing that and see you guys next month. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. And the principals will stay on for a little bit of debriefing right this minute, okay? And so let's stay on, and everyone else, thank you and bye-bye.